This week, we're hearing from 4 people who've all struggled with the same thing.
My sleep was suffering. This was a major problem.
I found myself more and more distracted.
I kind of feel the eyes of my colleagues all around me, and I wonder if they're watching me.
It also wasn't good for my sex life.
I must confess, it's happened to me too. Just the other day, I ordered my lunch and then, when it was ready, completely ignored the man behind the counter because I'd become engrossed in my phone. "10 years ago, the original Apple iPhone went on sale and the smartphone revolution began. 10 years later, many of us hold in our palms or pockets incredible tools to connect, create, and learn. But like our expert witnesses this week, if you own a smartphone, I'm sure you've got a story about how you or someone you know might be using it a bit too much. I'm James Fletcher, and on The Inquiry this week, we're asking, why can't we stop looking at our phones?
Part 1. Phone Numbers.
One time we had a guest lecture in my class, and I went and sat in the audience.
This is Larry Rosen. He's a professor of psychology at California State University.
And literally right next to me there was a student, knowing he was sitting next to me, who spent the entire lecture on his phone answering text messages and checking Facebook.
Larry Rosen is the author of The Distracted Mind, Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World, and his research focuses on technology and its impact. So, how much do we look at our phones? It's a question Larry Rosen set out to answer recently in an experiment involving more than 200 undergraduates.
I had them put an app on their phone that counts how many times you unlock your phone each day and then how many total minutes it remains unlocked. We were exceedingly surprised to find that the average young adult unlocked their phone 60 times a day for a total of about 220 minutes.
220 minutes. That's over 3.5 hours, a lot of time. But we spend lots of time watching television or using desktop or laptop computers or, who knows, maybe even reading books. What's more telling is that we turn to our phones 60 times a day, and Larry Rosen says other studies suggest it might be even more.
They were finding people unlocking their phones 80, 90, 100 times a day.
So the idea that we can't stop looking at our phones is in part about how much we look at them, but it's also about where and when we look at them.
We're seeing a lot of research coming out right now about people in relationships, talking about how their spouses spend more time on the phone than talking with them. They have trouble getting their spouse's attention.
Some of us use our phones while driving, despite the risks. We keep them by our beds and check them at night, despite the impact on our sleep. So why do we reach for our phones when we should be focusing on something else? Larry Rosen says research points to several key drivers. One is anxiety about missing out.
Particularly focused on staying in connection with all of your communication modalities, which include text messaging, email, and most prominently social media. We're just starting to study now boredom. We're finding that people are no longer being able to tolerate being bored, a uniquely human state.
Remember those, anxiety and boredom. We'll return to them later. The final piece of the puzzle about how much we're connected to our phones is what happens when they're taken away. Larry Rosen has monitored heavy phone users when they're separated from their devices.
We're telling them a little lie that we need to move their phone about 5 feet back so it doesn't interfere with the equipment. And then we are surreptitiously texting them while they are doing complicated tasks. As soon as that text dings, there is a spike in the galvanic skin response, which shows anxiety or arousal, and there's a spike in their heart rate, which shows arousal.
Of course, not everyone has this reaction. Although the idea of smartphone addiction is bandied around, it's controversial, and most experts agree that the number of people who are truly addicted in a clinical sense is low. But Larry Rosen claims a greater number are what he calls obsessed with their smartphones.
So we're seeing that people are pretty connected to these devices and cannot stand to be without them.
Our first expert witness has told us we check our phones a lot, and we do it even though it detracts from other things in our lives. When we can't check our phones, some of us become stressed out. Two big drivers are anxiety and boredom. But they could lead us to do all sorts of things. Why are our phones so compelling?
Part 2. The Psychology of Compulsion.
I'll find myself in an important board meeting or a faculty meeting, and I kind of feel the eyes of my colleagues all around me, and I wonder if they're watching me, and yet I still cannot stop from just hovering my finger and clicking to press my email.
Our second expert witness, struggling with her phone use, is anthropology professor Natasha Schull from New York University.
Even the most rational of us, or those who like to think that we're rational and in control and have some measure of willpower, are quite defenseless when all of these interfaces and buttons are just hovering right there, promising something.
Natasha Schull is an expert in how things can be designed to be compelling and addictive.
If you look at what is compelling to us as a species, it's very often things like sex, other people, food, but now we've got this computerized technology. It's like taking the natural formula for what is compelling and addicting and just intensifying that.
So what is the natural formula for what's compelling and addictive?
Well, I always find it very illuminating to return to the 1950s and 60s and the work of B.F. Skinner, known as the father of behaviorism.
B.F. Skinner was an American psychologist who conducted a series of famous experiments to discover how behaviour is shaped by rewards or punishments. He put animals, like pigeons, in cages known as Skinner boxes, where they could press a lever to get a reward such as food. If the two are directly linked, so every press on the lever delivers the same amount of food,
it turns out that is not so compelling and addicting because it has predictability. You know when the reward's going to come, so you press and then you go about your business, and when you're hungry, you come back.
So Skinner experimented with other relationships between action and reward.
What he discovered in the 50s and 60s was the most compelling and addictive form of reward schedule is called the intermittent variable ratio reinforcement schedule, which is a real mouthful, but it boils down in plain English to not knowing how much you're going to get and not knowing when it's going to come.
If the animals knew that pressing the lever would result in food, they only pressed it when they were hungry. But if they pressed the lever, and sometimes they got food and sometimes they didn't, they kept on pressing. They became hooked. To explain his work, Skinner likened the pigeons to gamblers at slot machines.
He said, you can go to Atlantic City and see people sitting at slot machines. What's keeping them there? Well, that same thing is keeping the pigeons pressing these levers.
Natasha Schull has written a book called Addiction by Design about how slot machines work. She says the key for humans as much as animals is the variable reward, not knowing what you're going to get.
We're kind of built to figure things out and to find incredibly fascinating what is uncertain and unknown and what you can't quite puzzle out.
B.F. Skinner wasn't just observing a natural formula for addiction. More controversially, his work also suggested that by designing the system of rewards, you could influence behaviour. It's something slot machine designers had already figured out.
They view the world really as this big experimental laboratory. They put things out in the world, they see how people respond, and then they pick what works best.
And it's worked extremely well. Slot machines generate the majority of casino profits. Players also become addicted 3 to 4 times faster than other gamblers. Our second expert witness has explained how variable rewards are the key to making something compelling, and how slot machines show that products can be designed to take advantage of this. But what do pigeons and slot machines have to do with smartphones?
There's not so many steps of remove between a pigeon pecking with her beak at a little red light, waiting to see when is that pellet going to come out, to a slot machine player in a casino, pressing that button again and again and again, to someone on a train on their morning commute, picking up their cell phone and checking their text messages, or maybe going into a Facebook stream to check, what's come up next, what's there, check, check, check. It's a very similar loop, and it's a very similar reinforcement schedule.
You're listening to The Inquiry with me, James Fletcher. There are lots of other editions available for you to listen to. Just search for The Inquiry Podcast.
Part 3. Habit-forming tech.
So a few years ago, I had this problem where I found that every night I was going to bed later and later because I was on my device, and that wasn't good for my sleep schedule.
This is Nir Eyal.
And it also wasn't good for my sex life.
Nir is a successful author and entrepreneur. His success sprang from an insight he had while running his own tech startup company.
I was at the intersection of gaming and advertising, and this was back in 2007 when we started the company, and those two industries are really dependent on changing user behavior, and what I found was that there was a lot of techniques that were being used, but nobody was kind of connecting those back to sound psychology principles.
So Nir Eyal set about developing a theory that took the insights of people like B.F. Skinner and applied them to the tech world. The result was a book called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. He says you start with a trigger, like a notification, and then move to a reward, ideally a variable reward.
The mother of habit-forming technology is probably email. I mean, email is a fantastic variable reward mechanism because we've all seen how email sometimes can deliver good news, sometimes it's bad news, sometimes it's irrelevant, sometimes it's super important, and that variability keeps us guessing.
It's easy to see the factors at play on our phones. All those notifications triggering us, all those apps, Facebook, Twitter, Tinder, Snapchat, which we eagerly open, never knowing what reward we're going to get.
The reason that we look at these devices as much as we do is no accident. It is quite deliberate. It just so happens that the technologies that we carry in our pockets happen to be a very good delivery device for many of these variable rewards.
Companies can experiment with rewards and other design features, and our phones provide lots of data about exactly what keeps us using their app.
So every time we give the product data, content, we accrue friends or followers, we're literally building the product with the company. We're customizing it to our needs and preferences based on our data so that it becomes better and better over time.
The goal, according to Nir Eyal, is that our use of these products becomes habitual.
Eventually, I begin to associate using a technology like email with feeling bored or feeling anxious. So when we're feeling lonely, we check Facebook. When we're uncertain, we check Google. When we're feeling bored, we check YouTube or the news or whatever. We use their products to satisfy these needs, to scratch our itch with little or no conscious thought.
So why can't we stop looking at our phones? Our third expert witness has explained how companies use the psychological principles we heard about in part 2 and powerful technology to get us, in his words, hooked. Our phones are always with us and can become our default response to those internal triggers we heard about in part 1, boredom or anxiety. But Nir Eyal doesn't want us to forget that we use products we like and that work for us.
I mean, give me a break. These products are enhancing our lives. I kind of take issue with the premise of the show in that why can't we stop checking our devices? Well, we most certainly can stop checking our devices. This isn't brain control.
Part 4. What's in it for you?
I worked in the tech industry for a very long time. Worked for Apple when I was 18 years old as a software engineer. Dreamed of affecting people's lives in a positive way and building the next bicycle for our minds.
Our final expert witness is Tristan Harris.
I really just became aware of certain incentives in the technology industry that prevent, I think, good-intentioned people from necessarily being able to create the kind of impact that we want.
10 years ago, Tristan had a startup which helped explain and make sense of things people read on the web. They trialled it with the BBC and the New York Times, driven by idealistic desires.
To help people learn about things and, in our words, put lighter fluid over the sparks of curiosity. But at the end of the day, customers like the BBC or the New York Times were only happy when we basically were able to keep people on their website for as long as possible. And so there's this subtle, gap that started to brew between what your social mission was, which was helping people learn, and then what our actual incentives were, which were to keep people on the website for as long as possible.
Tristan Harris says these incentives are pervasive throughout the technology industry.
Whether it's an education website or a meditation app or an addictive game or Facebook, at the end of the day, you're still competing for attention. So you have to design to keep people hooked. And so this war for attention becomes this escalation for who's better at persuading your mind, who's better at hijacking the way your mind works. And it's not because anyone has any evil intentions, it's just because the competition for attention is so intense that everyone must suddenly juice up their apps with these different hijacking techniques just to even enter the game.
Companies have always tried to attract us to their products, but technology takes this to another level.
When people ever talk about their responsibility in using technology and, oh man, I guess it's my fault that I'm so distracted all the time, people need to realize that there's at least 100 or sometimes 1,000 people on the other side of the screen whose job every single day is to figure out how to get you to use the product as much as possible.
Our previous expert witness, Nir Eyal, argues that companies do that by giving you what you want. But Tristan Harris suggests what we want might have a downside.
Facebook finds out that when it shows you articles that generate outrage, which is very common today, it can put more of those articles in front of you because it gets more traffic.
To be clear, this isn't because someone at Facebook thinks it's a good idea. It's because there's an algorithm that's serving you whatever articles get the most attention.
And so overall, there's this huge difference between what works on getting someone to click or what works on getting your mind to act a certain way versus what might be good for you and what you really want. And so it's really about changing the currency of success from time spent to something more like time well spent.
Time Well Spent is the name of Tristan's organisation and the movement he's trying to start. One idea is to develop new ways for people to rate apps, like the dating app Tinder, for example.
Let's say Tinder was obligated or your phone just showed you, okay, here's how much time you're spending on Tinder. Your habit is mostly something like 20 minutes a day, swiping, and here's all the messages you've sent. And then the question it would ask you is, given this entire footprint of use, how did that work out for you?
The idea is to move from habitual or unconscious behaviour to conscious reflection. You'd answer explicitly in terms of whether you felt it made your life better, however you choose to define that. Then, when other people search for something to help them date, they'd see the results ranked by time well spent, rather than sales or downloads.
Facebook could say, hey, I got this salsa dance that's starting in 30 minutes down the street. And Duolingo can say, hey, I've got this language pack for flirting in Portuguese since you're in Portugal right now. And each of these apps would be competing for what would actually help you the most right now, not competing for how can I get your attention right now.
That would require big changes from Apple and Google, who control the main smartphone app stores and environments. At the moment, there's no great clamour for this to happen. But Tristan hopes there's a precedent for people demanding something different once they realise what goes into the products they consume.
So time well spent, we metaphorically talk about it as something like what the organic movement was for the food industry. Before organic, it's a bunch of farmers making lettuce, and it's all about who can put the lettuce on the shelf for the cheapest price. So how can we change the game so that it's not a race to the bottom? And the organic movement did that.
The organic movement was able to create a market for products that were more expensive by encouraging people to value things like food that's pesticide-free. Tristan Harris hopes to do the same for products that decide not to use certain persuasive techniques.
If I did that today, you would think no one likes that product, no one uses that product. But in a world of time well spent, which is metaphorically the organic kind of label or interest, movement that this is about, that product would be rated and rewarded for how much benefit it provides, not how much time it gets from your life.
So why can't we stop looking at our phones? Our expert witnesses have explained how compelling our phones are and how this isn't just because they're packed full of useful features. Tech companies are competing for our attention and using powerful techniques to get it. The question we haven't answered is the one that lies at the heart of many political debates in consumer society. Are those techniques so powerful that we need help to resist them? Or is our free will enough? And does it even matter? We'll leave that one to you. But if you feel the need to cut back, here's a tip from Nir Eyal, the man who teaches companies how to get us hooked.
Everyone should take 5 minutes and just change the notification settings so that you don't get these constant pings and buzzes from the app makers. Change the notification settings.
This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, James Fletcher, and produced in London by Ruth Alexander and Charlotte MacDonald. It was mixed by James Beard. The editor is Richard Knight. Next week, Ruth Alexander is asking what happened to Europe's migrant crisis. And don't forget, you can catch up with all of our past programmes if you search for The Inquiry Podcast. And before you go, there's one other podcast we're recommending too. Our colleagues have made a 5-part series called Intrigue, Murder in the Lucky Holiday Hotel. Check it out, it's gripping. Thanks for downloading The Inquiry. This week, we're hearing from 4 people who've all struggled with the same thing.
My sleep was suffering. This was a major problem.
I found myself more and more distracted.
I kind of feel the eyes of my colleagues all around me, and I wonder if they're watching me.
It also wasn't good for my sex life.
I must confess, it's happened to me too. Just the other day, I ordered my lunch and then, when it was ready, completely ignored the man behind the counter because I'd become engrossed in my phone. "10 years ago, the original Apple iPhone went on sale and the smartphone revolution began. 10 years later, many of us hold in our palms or pockets incredible tools to connect, create, and learn. But like our expert witnesses this week, if you own a smartphone, I'm sure you've got a story about how you or someone you know might be using it a bit too much. I'm James Fletcher, and on The Inquiry this week, we're asking, why can't we stop looking at our phones?
Part 1. Phone numbers.